Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to, are we calling it Maharat's Elul series? Is that the right title? Okay. Welcome to our Elul series. I'm Sofia Freudenstein. I am going to be graduating Yeshivat Maharat this year, school year, in 2025. And I'm very excited to share some Torah with you here tonight that I have been thinking about for a while, and admittedly is like a bit daunting in figuring out how to like talk about it and share it, because it's going to be some philosophy. So get ready to put your philosopher hats on. But I've found it to be particularly meaningful when thinking about my own Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur also, and the nature of repentance. So I'm hoping that's what we can all be doing here tonight. I would definitely love for there to be participation when I invite it. So if you're comfortable with that, that would be awesome. And then we can have a nice back and forth. Yeah, that's basically my framing before we get started. So what I want to do is I want to study a passage from Masechet Yoma, which is in the Talmud, and I want to use the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas as a kind of commentator and commentary to the text. So let me explain what I mean by that. Emmanuel Levinas was a philosopher from the 20th century. He was born in 1906, died in 1995. And he was a philosopher that like the rest of the world outside of the Jewish world knew of. He did a lot of post-Holocaust theology, which is a lot of like, how do we live in a world after such thing as the Holocaust could happen? And in particular, he talked about this idea of the other, encountering the other, that like we need to be in relationship with people different to us. And having that kind of empathy is what will make sure we live in a safer world where we are able to empathize and think about others. So that is what he's just known for in general in the world of philosophy. What's something that's less well known is that he also wrote a whole commentary on passages of the Talmud, which is pretty unusual for just like a generic philosopher. I was exposed to his work on Talmud actually in Israel this past year. A lot of Israelis are very aware of Levinas's works, probably because like translating from French into Hebrew is like maybe a little less complicated than French to English. Like you can preserve something about the French differently in the Hebrew, or that there's just like people of European descent in Israel. Fascinatingly enough, is just like more culturally relevant there. And so that's where I encountered these for the first time. There's not so many English translations. There's only one, which I have here and that we have on our source sheet tonight. And that's really it. So there's a lot that can be done in the world of like Levinas, Talmud, and English that I think should be coming to North America. So maybe this can be our attempt at starting that. And I think it's particularly powerful because of his philosophical background, but it's also his desire to be like in the world of Jewish text. So what I want to do tonight is start us off with a little bit of like Levinas's approach to Talmud in general, and then we'll see how it applies to this sugya from Masechet Yoma about tshuva, and hopefully we'll see how they can go hand in hand and help us make the page come more alive. So that's the plan. Okay, I'm going to share my screen, although I believe you have the source sheets as well. That will mean on a technical level, if you have something to say, definitely like the raising hand function or just unmuting would be awesome. That's what we do in like real life. So that's my caveat, I guess, at the beginning. Okay. Oh, fun. Did not realize that you could comment on my source sheet. So let me create a copy of it so that we don't have that problem here. Okay. Should be good. Okay, great. Okay, so how far does repentance go? So this passage here at the beginning, before we get into our sugya, is about Levinas's worldview about the nature of Talmud study in general. So I'm going to read it here for us, and this will be the framing that we have for his project with our sugya coming up. Okay, he says, "It is certain that, when discussing the right to eat or not to eat an egg hatched on a holy day, or payments for damages caused by a wild ox, the sages of the Talmud are discussing neither an egg nor an ox, but are arguing about fundamental ideas without appearing to do so. It is true that one needs to have encountered an authentic Talmudic master to be sure of it. To retrace one's steps from these questions of ritual, which are quite important for the continuity of Judaism, to philosophical problems long forgotten by contemporary Talmudists, who indeed demand a great effort today. In the renewal of studies we hope for in this area, it is clear one cannot start at the end." So, complicated wording, but what Levinas is talking about is often within reading Talmudic texts, there's like weird things that come up. For those of us in Yeshivat Maharat, the students here, we're learning Masechet Beitza, which is all about eggs and eggs that hatch on Yom Tov. Or Masechet like Bava Kama, we learn about tort law and about how oxes gore other oxes. And that could just seem like pedantic conversations. But what Levinas is telling us is that it's never just a pedantic conversation. There's always a larger philosophical discussion being had by the rabbis when they're talking about these somewhat pedantic things. And it's our job as readers and people who are invested in the Talmudic project to try and find the meaning behind the back and forth that is happening there. And he also is reflecting on, usually you have a philosopher and usually you have a Talmudist, but they don't often go together. And so it would be really great for them to be learning from one another. Philosophers don't usually know how to tap into like the technical skills of Talmud, but also Talmudists might not be able to take that like zooming out big picture kind of approach. And it would be really meaningful for us to see and read Talmud in this way and realizing that conversations that might seem theoretical or might seem kind of abstract actually are really important and actually need to apply to our lives. And it's our job to figure out how to do that. So that's the framing that he has in general about the Talmudic readings that he's chosen. And that is what we're going to hopefully see in our reading of Levinas's Towards the Other, which is about Masechet Yoma. And that's now what we're going to be doing. Another important background historical piece is that Levinas gives this particular speech about Masechet Yoma in 1964. He gives it in France, and he's thinking a lot about the Holocaust and about what kinds of reparations exist or should exist for Jews who are victims of the Holocaust, and what does apologizing for something like the Holocaust look like? And that is what he's thinking about that upcoming Yom Kippur, which is pretty intense. And that is going to be in the back of his mind in the responses he has to Yoma here that we're going to look at. Okay. Any questions so far before we get into the text? Cool. Anyone feeling like a little like overwhelmed? That's okay if that's true. I promise it's going to feel easier as we go along. Cool. Okay. Would anyone like to read for us the Mishnah here in Masechet Yoma? You can read in either the Hebrew or the English, whatever works for you. Sure, Emily, go for it.
Okay. Avirot shebein adam lemakom Yom HaKippurim mechaper. Avirot shebein adam lechavero ein Yom HaKippurim mechaper ad sheyirtzeh et chavero. So do you want me to translate?
Yeah,
or I'll just read English. Okay. Transgressions between a person and God, Yom Kippur atones for those. But for transgressions between one person and another, Yom Kippur does not atone until that person like seeks forgiveness or appeases the other person.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you, Emily. So what we see in the Mishnah is that there's two kinds of sins that you can do. One is ben adam lamakom, what I will do in relationship to God. So that might be, I forgot to shake lulav one day, like these ritual kind of things that don't involve other people. That's one kind of sin. But then there's ben adam lachavero, which is more interpersonal. So if I cheated in business, or if I said lashon hara, that would be an example of ben adam lachavero. And what we're seeing here is the nature of Yom Kippur in being an opportunity for those sins to now be forgiven. And what the Mishnah is saying is that sins that are bein adam l'makom, between us and God, just having Yom Kippur and like doing Yom Kippur is enough for us to be forgiven. However, for sins that are between us and our friends or other people, Yom Kippur is not enough. I'm curious what people think about that. What does that tell us, maybe what the Mishnah thinks about interpersonal sins as opposed to sins between us and God? What could be the reasoning for there being different approaches to those?
Well, there's a practical way that you can do tshuva for a sin against another person. Well, with something that you've done against God, there's not a similar, very straightforward way of making amends.
Amazing. Okay, so Wilhelmina brings up a really good like logistical problem, which is that like, what does it look like for us to say, oh, I'm sorry, God? I mean, we have hopefully a theological relationship, but it's just way easier to actually go to another person and apologize and see demonstrably that they have forgiven you. And so like we should be doing that and not just relying on the day. Yes, Jennifer.
Well, there's the idea that something is broken in the world and God can fix it. And with people, if it's broken, it can't be fixed until the other person cooperates with you and works on that. helps me.
Interesting. Right. So God is able to fix anything. And so like God doesn't need our apology, right? Like God's God. However, with people, like there's an opportunity for us to fix it here on this realm. Totally. Any other thoughts? Anyone disagree? Like maybe thinking that like there's something almost like a kind of hierarchy here. Like it almost is saying like it's easier for us to like be forgiven for ritual sin, but it's easier because you can do it in real time with other people. Like does it feel confusing or surprising to you that it's listed this way? I was surprised when I first saw it because I felt like when looking at it, that sins between me and God feel more serious. And yet it seems like if I just like do Yom Kippur, it's fine. While like it seems that there needs to be more effort interpersonally. And so that was shocking to me that seems to suggest it was like heavier in a different way. Oh, did someone have something to share? Maybe I missed it. Oh, Gabrielle, go for it.
I have a question. Is the Mishnah talking about Yom Kippur the day or the Avodah, the service that happens in the temple? And if it's the latter, then that causes a problem for us today. Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, this is a great question. The Gemara is going to expand on it. Is it just like, okay, 10th of Tishrei, cool, it's done. Now I've been forgiven. Or is it like the work that, especially during the time of the temple, involved a lot of sacrifices and a lot of bowing? Like that is a lot of work. Definitely a good question. There's a lot of like ranges of opinion. It seems to be that from a pshat understanding that really is just the day happening. There's something like about like almost the magic of Yom Kippur. This is where it feels kind of like I think uncomfortable, at least like in a modern sensibility, but like that is a real approach that exists within the Gemara that like actually it's just the day itself is good enough to cleanse ourselves from these things. But there also are opinions that say like it's not just about that, it's also about this kind of work. So that is a good point. That would definitely make it feel less like a hierarchy in a way. Okay, I'm reading in the chat what Rabbani Liz said. Okay, what Rabbani Liz says is exactly what Levinas is about to say. So, wow, Baruch Shekibant, which is that like God can decide what can be like forgiven, but how could God decide for another person if like they want to forgive someone about something, which is really powerful because obviously God could, but that there's something really powerful about a person authentically wanting to forgive another person. And then I also see in the chat that Emily said something, I guess similar actually as well, that like God is saying like, okay, like if you have an opportunity to like engage with another person and making this better, like you should be doing that. And that's like the mature thing to do. And also that will be like what is better for the relationship in the long run. So great. Everyone was saying very philosophical things. See, Levinas doesn't have to be so scary. Amazing. Let's see what Levinas has to say on the subject. Does anyone want to read this big Levinas paragraph? Okay, I can read. Okay, this is what he says. One could no doubt stop here. It could be concluded a bit hastily that Judaism values social morality above ritual practices, but the order could also be reversed. The fact that forgiveness for ritual offenses depends only on penitence, and consequently only on us, may project a new light on the meaning of ritual practices. Perhaps the ills that must heal inside the soul without the help of others are precisely the most profound ills, and that even with our social where our social faults are concerned, once our neighbor has been appeased, the most difficult part remains to be done. The ritual transgression that I want to erase without resorting to the help of others would be precisely that one that demands all my personality. It is the work of tshuva, of return, of which no one can take my place. So what Levinas is doing here is just like totally blurring, I think, like the distinctions that we were talking about, the hierarchies for sure. He says you could just read this Mishnah and say, okay, I think Bein Adam LaMakom is like this and Bein Adam LaChavero is like this. And often like this often happens in the Talmud where we think one is a more lenient option and then one is the more stringent option, but actually you could see it in a totally other way if you read it a different way. That seems to be what he's doing. Ultimately, what he's saying here is that like the idea that Yom Kippur could be in and of itself the thing that that atones for you, it seems to be a little bit more what Gabriel was saying, which is like, it's actually like the work that you do on that day, the setup of the day, whether it be Seder Avodah or like just the prayer process that leads you to tshuva, that actually might be what our Mishnah is saying. Like the inner work that no one else can do for you, that's actually going to be the main focus of what makes the day itself the thing that is now appeasing you. But that's different than when there's another person involved. And then that has to be a different kind of connection between the two. So I provide this as example number one of like, okay, here's Levinas trying to understand a Talmudic, here Mishnaic text, trying to show you different perspectives. And now, especially to have in the back of your mind in light of the historical context before and the audience he's delivering this to. This is to an audience of Jews and non-Jews in the Sorbonne in France. He is saying, there are sometimes sins that work this way on an individual level and now are different when they involve other people. And so that's going to get developed more as we go. Okay. So here we have a quick, somewhat complicated Gemara. We're going to read through it quickly just to show a challenge to the Mishnah. It says, it was taught in the Mishnah, Yom Kippur atones for sins committed against God, but does not atone for sins committed against other people. Rav Yosef Bar Chavu raised a contradiction before Rabbi Abahu. The Mishnah states that Yom Kippur does not atone for sins committed against a fellow person. But isn't it written, if one man sins against another, God, Elohim, will judge him? And then it says, who is Elohim? Actually, Elohim are judges. So very confusing kind of back and forth. But ultimately what Rav Yosef Bar Chavu is doing is saying, what do you mean Yom Kippur works this way? He's providing different challenges from other psukim. For example, here we do see in this pasuk that interpersonal bein adam l'chavero sins, actually God does get involved. But yet the stam of the Gemara really wants to say, no, that's not the case. You have to change the reading of Elohim to actually mean judges, which is something that often happens within Tanakh. Elohim can mean God or it can mean judges. But ultimately what this like back and forth is showing is we have a potential challenge of saying like interpersonal sins, maybe they don't need to be forgiven by each other, but could just be relied on the day. And the Gemara is like, no, not true. We really need to make sure that people are dealing with each other's malpractice to each other. That seems to be the push that the Gemara is having. You could have read it another way, but we want to say that sins between one another, bein adam l'chavero, are incredibly important. Okay. Now we're going to have another passage that's a little bit easier to follow, and we're going to see what Levinas has to say. These are now just like technical rules about how forgiveness should work, and Levinas is going to tease out some of the philosophical significance. Okay. V'amar Rav Yossi bar Chanina, kol mevakesh matu mechavero, al yevakesh mimenu yoter mishalosh pamim. Shne'amar, ana sana v'ata sana. Okay, so Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina says, anyone who asks for forgiveness from someone should not do it more than 3 times, as it says. And then there's this pasuk where it says na 3 times, if you read it kind of complicatedly, and they say, oh, it says na 3 times, therefore you should only ask for forgiveness 3 times, but not more than that. V'imit mevi asara b'nei adam u'ma'amidan al kivro ve'omer chatati l'Adonai Elohei Yisrael v'lifloni shechavalti bo. And if the person who you wanted to forgive you passes away, you bring 10 people to their grave and you say, I have sinned, I've caused you pain. So before we get into the Levinas, why do we think Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina would say that you shouldn't ask for forgiveness more than 3 times? Why would we do that? Why would we even like codify something like that and say like there's rules, no more than 3 times? Does anyone have any thoughts?
Very simplistic idea would be that we want the person to ask human being for forgiveness. We want that person to engage in attempt, but we don't want to blame them if they did everything on their side what they could, but they weren't successful.
So if I understand what you're saying, Miriam, you're saying like after 3 times, you're thinking about the person asking for forgiveness, like they tried their best. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. I think that there's 2 levels of forgiveness. The real damage that in the real world, and there is psychological process. And I think that we try to cover both bases.
Okay, interesting. Any other ideas appear for maybe why no more than 3 times? Okay, Kana says to release the sinner from psychic chains of accountability. Wow, that's said very intensely. Yeah, like 3 times and then you're done. Like that's just how it works. And like they tried their best and they shouldn't have to now like feel guilty or bad that they haven't received the forgiveness that they deserve. Okay. Any other thoughts?
I think also from the side of the person being asked, like at a certain point, if you've rejected the person asking you so many times, it's honestly kind of offensive that they keep asking. Like, I told you no, like stop bothering me. Like they're committing another offense almost by not respecting that you don't have it in them, or you don't want to forgive them.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Zoe. Yeah, that's like it's an interesting question. Like, what is the no more than 3 times coming to do? The first kind of answers we saw here is that it's not fair to the original sinner. They're trying their best. But then also you think like, okay, but there must be a reason why they're not getting forgiven 3 times. Like maybe actually the person who had the malpractice or something bad done to them is saying like, you actually don't get it. Like, it's not just about apologizing. Like, do you even realize the thing that you did wrong? And that's definitely going to come up more with Levinas when thinking about these like larger reparations questions that are going to come up. So, okay, everyone was saying things that once again, Levinas was bringing up. You two are all philosophers. Okay. This is what Levinas says. There would be 3 entreaties or a ternary rhythm in this passage, which would prove the thesis of Rav Yossi bar Hanina. The commentators discuss its cogency. What does it matter? I would like to spend some time on the choice of biblical verse. What example of an offense was sought in the Bible for this occasion? It is the story of the brothers who sold their brother into slavery. An exploitation of man by man would therefore be the prototypical offense, imitated by all offenses, even verbal. So Levinas is doing something that's helpful for any kind of piece of Talmud, is whenever we see a verse that's quoted from the Torah, it's great to see the context that it's coming from. And he also is saying that it's always intentional. It's never just that the rabbis are like looking on their Google or their Sefaria or their concordance saying, where's the word that's going to prove the thing I want it to prove? It's that often they're choosing a pasuk intentionally and aware of the context in which it comes and it's coming to tell us something. And so he's saying that this verse actually comes from the end of Sefer Bereshit, when Yaakov has passed away, and Yosef and the brothers are negotiating and figuring out what to do now that Yaakov has died. The brothers are really worried Yosef is going to turn on them and be super angry that they sold him into slavery. And so they are apologizing to him yet again. Ultimately, he's going to forgive them and it'll be fine. But that is the context in which this verse is coming. And of course, it's a perfect example of interpersonal, right? Brothers selling brothers into slavery. That is an example of an Aveira, Ben Adam l'Chaveiro. And so what Levinas is saying is that this general rule about the nature of apologizing is being proven with a verse like this that's coming to tell you that interpersonal relationships are incredibly important and figuring out how to forgive each other is incredibly important. Okay. Okay, nice. Rabbi Liz also mentions the importance of 3 from before. Now there's going to be a chazakah that they will not be forgiven. So they had a chance maybe in the first 1 or 2 tries to assume that maybe they had a chance, but after 3, you're kind of stuck. Awesome. Okay. Now what we're going to do is we're going to read 2 weird stories about Rav and about the nature of him trying to get forgiveness from other people, because we just saw a bunch of thoughts about that. And often what happens in Gemara is that you'll have some kind of statement, and then you're going to have a story that happens that is like the real application of that principle. And we see kind of how it might go not so clearly or as simply as one might expect in real life, in the stories that happen to the actual rabbis. And that's what we're going to see here. Okay. Does anyone want to read the English for us of this very dramatic story? Cool. Okay, thanks, Jen. Let me share once again. Okay.
All right.
Go for it.
It is further related that Rav had a complaint against a certain butcher who had insulted him. The butcher did not come before him to apologize. On Yom Kippur Eve, Rav said, I will go and appease him. He met his student Rav Huna, who said to him, where is my master going? He said to him, I am going to appease so-and-so. Rav Huna called Rav by his name and said, Abba is going to kill a person, for surely that person's end will not be good. Rav went and stood by him. He found the butcher sitting and splitting the head of an animal. The butcher raised his eyes and saw him. He said to him, "Are you Abba? Go, I have nothing to say to you." Oh, while he was splitting the head, one of the bones of the head flew out and struck him in the throat and killed him, thereby fulfilling Rav Huna's prediction.
Okay, thank you for the very dramatic read. That was helpful, adding some of the emotion in. Okay, so just so we are clear what the story is, Rav knows a butcher. He thinks that the butcher did something bad to him and that he deserves an apology. So on Yom Kippur Eve, Rav says, okay, I'm going to go to the butcher and I'll give him the opportunity to apologize and I'll forgive him, doing him a favor. And then he sees Rav Huna, and Rav Huna's like, oh no, like this is not going to go well. I'm worried that someone's going to die, which is kind of extreme. But Rav then goes, sees the butcher doing what butchers do, which is like splitting in on heads of animals. And the butcher's like, no, I'm not going to apologize to you. Like, I don't want to. But then when he does that, one of the, when he was splitting the head, one of the bones comes and kills the butcher, which then is the foreshadowing we saw before. Rav Huna saying, oh no, like someone's going to kill him. Someone's going, that Rav is going to kill someone actually happens. So what is this story? It's quite weird. Do you have any thoughts about what's going on? What's up with Rav? Why do you think he's going there? What happened? Why did the butcher die in the end? Emily, go for it.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering, like, what is it about the apology here? Because it seems like Rav was ready to forgive him, but there still needs to be this like formal process of the butcher apologizing to him before he could appease him. But it's kind of like, why didn't you just go and just say like, I forgive you, even if the butcher was refusing to engage?
Yeah, great question. In my head, it feels like, yeah, if he's like ready to forgive him, then he just should. But it almost seems to me, I mean, maybe I'm like reading too much character onto Rav, that Rav is like, oh, well, I deserve an apology, so I'm going to give him the opportunity to give me one, which doesn't feel so great. And also it's like not what the butcher wants to do. So that would be like one, I guess, potential answer is like, maybe Rav didn't have the best intentions about wanting to forgive. But it is weird. Like you might just think like, okay, if he forgives him, it happened in his heart and like that's that. Why does there have to be this formal process of apology?
Look, it could be another mechanism here. The mechanism, like very, very simplistic again, on a simple pshat level, is that he's a righteous person. He's a Rav. He's important rabbi. He has this power. Butcher is a simple man. The simple man did something against, and we know also that we don't attribute good character traits to butchers. You become butcher because you have like this bloody, simplistic. We don't have many very big rabbis in Talmud who are butchers. So here is this Am Haaretz who offended the rabbi or did something bad for the rabbi. Now the rabbi wants to give him the chance to repent, and he refuses that chance before Yom Kippur. He gets immediately punished. It's like immediate karma. So what Rav caused was not understanding the character of the butcher, giving him chance in the wrong time, and inadvertently, unwanted consequences, he killed him. By very act of opening this door, he's a grama. It's a kind of grama killing. If like din min hashamayim, it's like God's intervention. He kind of, this moment of judgment comes, and he just opens the door for this moment of judgment that comes, slips in and just So that's what, and he's the facilitator of that because he chosen to open the door.
Yeah. Right. What Miriam is pointing out is that we see here that it's on the eve of Yom Kippur, which is obviously a good time to be thinking about tshuva, but it's also like a very auspicious time. It's like the Serei Tshuva. We're seeing who's going to be written in the book of life and the book of death. And so Rav doing this, and like especially doing with the butcher who you're pointing out, like within Talmudic like lore is not a person who's so great at controlling their emotions. It's often quite violent. Like it was the wrong place, wrong time to kind of like have this conversation. And because of the auspicious of the day and the nature of the butcher, like it is like Rob should have known better and should have been more careful, because this of course was going to be like the thing that happened to him in the end. Yeah, cool read. I hadn't thought about the butcher part before. Emily says relatable though. Fascinating. I guess either the butcher part, the anger part, or really wanting to be forgiven and thinking you deserve that. Like I think that for me, what a lot of these stories, I mean, thank God, never this extreme, is that I feel like what these stories are beginning to tease out, and that Levinas is going to pick on too, is that the interpersonal relationships are really complicated, and like there can be formal ways of doing apologies, and often both for the person receiving the apology and giving the apology, there's like so many other layers of what is going on that I feel like these stories really tease out. Yes, okay, I'm saying about wanting an apology. Right, like Rob wants to say like I was wronged, and I'm not even sure the butcher even like fully understands what he did wrong. And that can be really painful, and also like really painful then to explain to someone like what they did wrong. That kind of like misses the whole point sometimes. Awesome. Any other thoughts that people want to share?
I think there's a bit of a reversal with Rob going to appease the person who insulted him, where it should be the other way around.
Okay.
And it might just be a case of projection where, you know, really he needs to let this guy go through his process, and he doesn't, you know, he has to wait. He has to wait for him to come to him. You just got to wait for people to kind of grow up into whatever they're supposed to do. You can't do it for them, and you can't, oh, I'll just nudge him along. Well,
Right.
results might not work out the way you think it's going to work out.
Totally. Which I think gets back to like this idea of like what is the purpose of tshuva, and even all the way back to the Mishnah. Is it just that like a day happens and then like people are forgiven, or like it's actually about a kind of process you need to go through? Like what is authentic tshuva? Like it should be that like you really thought about it and you want to be there. If you force someone into that, like is that really then meaning that they want to be changing themselves? Totally. Okay, any last thoughts before we go on to the second story about Rav?
I going off of what Gabrielle said, it does seem that there's a valid interpretation that the butcher didn't have any particular knowledge that Rob had this complaint, and that it was made that Rob was sort of hanging out there waiting for this butcher to understand the fact that he had some sort of complaint that Shuba had to happen, but that the butcher just kind of like, oh, there's this guy who comes and gets meat from me every Tuesday, and he hasn't been around lately, and goes on with his life because he doesn't know about the complaint.
Right. Yeah, there is like this kind of disconnect that's going on like between the people, which doesn't feel like what you need in order for tshuva to happen. Totally, they're out of sync.
And I'm rereading it now, and it really, like the visual of it is striking. You know, he's standing there, like lurking.
Yeah. It's
like,
how
about Shalom Alecha Rabbi? You know, how about like, you know, create an opening. This guy's busy, you know, he's gotta cut this, you know, it's Erev Yom Kippur, and everybody needs their everyone needs their steak for Motzei Yom Kippur. You know, everyone's gotta.
Yeah, right. Like right, exactly. Like the butcher's busy and he's just like breathing down his neck, being like, hello, it's time for an apology, which is a lot. Okay, I'm also seeing here, Jen asks, is there another example where Hashem strikes down someone so they can't sin again or sin worse? Unfortunately, yes. There is like a whole like interesting question about like theology in the Talmud and like how God works. Like a quick example that comes to mind is like in the story of Tanur Shalachnai, which is a whole story in and of itself. There is a rabbi that is excommunicated, Rabbi Eliezer, and by Rabban Gamliel, and Rabbi Eliezer prays so hard that if he like prayed hard enough that God could strike him down, because he's like so sad about being excommunicated, and then the prayer would be so strong that it would kill Rabban Gamliel. So then Rabbi Eliezer's wife Ima Shalom has to like try and stop him from praying Tachanun. So it would be so awful. But then you're like, but why did God create a world? Like God doesn't have to like strike someone down just because someone davened Tachanun really hard and was very upset at someone. So it's a whole interesting question about like how does God function in the Talmud in general. And it does feel kind of like, it feels both that like we have a lot of power and also that like God is doing some like pretty intense striking people down, which is a weird balance that I'm sure there is a paper that like explains a consistent approach to that, but I have seen it before in the Talmud, which is, I guess, for better or worse. Yes, Achnai bingo. You can only go so long in a year without mentioning Tanur Achnai. Okay, let's go into the second story because it's also about Rav and his like confusing ways of thinking about apologies. And then we'll get even closer to like what I really want to take home for what Levinas takes home from these stories. Okay, this one's a little longer. Anyone want to try and read it for us?
Okay, I can. Rabbi Hia, Rav's uncle and teacher, came in, whereupon Rav returned to the beginning of the portion and began to read it again. Afterward, Bar Kapara came in, and Rav returned to the beginning of the portion out of respect for Bar Kapara. Then Rabbi Shimon, son of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, came in, and he returned again to the beginning of the portion. Then Rabbi Hanina Bar Hama came in, and Rav said to himself, "Shall I go back to read so many times?" He did not return, but continued from where he was. Rabbi Hanina was offended. Rav went before Rabbi Hanina on Yom Kippur Eve every year for 13 years to appease him, but he would not be appeased. The Gemara asked, how could Rav act this way? Didn't Rabbi Yosef Bar Hanina say anyone who requests forgiveness from another should not ask more than 3 times? The Gemara answers, Rav is different. The Gemara asks, and how could Rabbi Hanina act this way and refuse to forgive Rav, though he asked so many times? Didn't Rava say, with regard to anyone who suppresses his honor and forgives someone for hurting him, God pardons all his sins? The Gemara explains, rather, this is what happened. Rabbi Hanina saw in a dream that Rav was being hung on a palm tree, and he learned as a tradition that anyone about whom there is a dream in which he is being hung on a palm tree will become head of a yeshiva. He said, learn from this, that Providence has decreed that he must eventually become the head of the yeshiva. Therefore, I will not be appeased, so that he will have to go and study Torah in Babylonia.
Okay, thank you. Yet another dramatic read, so thank you very much. Okay, let's break down what's happening in this story. So Rav, this is like an interesting thing about the nature of like oral Torah study. He's reading, he comes in, reads a section, reads it again. And so you're imagining like some people like trickling late into class, like, okay, Rabbi Chia shows up in the middle of Rav doing, he goes, okay, I guess I'll start again. Then Bar Kapar comes in, the same thing happens, he starts all over again. Rabbi Shimon, son of Rebbe, does it, same thing. But then Rabbi Hanina Bar Chama comes in, and Rav is like, oh my goodness, I'm gonna have to go back again? Like, no, sit here, you're not gonna get that. But Rabbi Hanina is really offended. He's like, all the other rabbis had the opportunity to like learn from the beginning, and like you respected them enough to like go back to the beginning now that they joined the room, and now you're not gonna do that for me. So he was offended. Rav then, in like an opposite way from before, where he's the one trying to give for forgiveness, now he is asking for forgiveness from Rabbi Hanina, also on Yom Kippur Eve, and he does it every year for 13 years. And then, of course, the Gemara in like a very like pedantic way is like, okay, but before you said no more than 3 times. Why is Rav not following that rule? And they go, oh, well, Rav is very special. Okay. Or it could be the Gemara kind of recognizing it's not so simply like just 3, like it's a little more, it's a little less black and white than that. So then the Gemara says, well, okay, how could Rav act this way, like we said? Oh, sorry, I explained that before. Now we're going to say, what does Rabbi Hanina, why did he not forgive? Shouldn't that be enough? Like he tried his best and he came to apologize. And then the Gemara gives a very strange answer. And the Gemara says, well, the reason why Rabbi Hanina couldn't forgive Rav is that he had a dream about Rav being hung on a palm tree. And that meant he was going to be Rosh Yeshiva one day, specifically in Babylonia. This is like the beginning of the shift from the Yerushalmi, like Palestinian Talmud world, into the Babylonian world. Rav will need to leave the land of Israel to go to Babylonia and then start all the yeshiva that constitute like what becomes the headquarters of the Babylonian Talmud. And he needs to go there. So like Rav needs to be not forgiven so that he can like be so embarrassed and run away so that he then goes starts these yeshivas in Babylonia to then become like our main heritage today. So basically this like crazy back and forth is that Rav offends Rabbi Hanina, and then Rabbi Hanina doesn't forgive him. Rav is confused why, and Rabbi Hanina, according to the Gemara, the reason why he doesn't forgive him is because actually it'll do him good for him to not be forgiven, because it'll help the rest of the Jewish people in the long run. very complicated story. Anyone have thoughts? Yes, Gabrielle.
Well, I think this maybe helps us understand the previous story. Maybe that previous story happens like year 7, let's say.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
he's so yearning
Hmm.
for, for the forgiveness. And he's like, I'm going to do the right thing. I'm going to forget, Rakia won't forgive me, but I'm going to forgive this butcher. I'm going to go make the extra effort. And
Wow.
it's like, buddy, that's your emotional need. That's you're not helping the butcher at all.
Yeah, like we get like this interesting like psychological background of like, why does Rav want to forgive someone so much? Because he really wants to be forgiving also. And then you feel kind of bad for Rav because up until now, I kind of was like, Rav seems annoying. And now I feel like I have like a slightly more empathetic insight into the way that he's thinking. Yeah. Okay, Jen says, Rav Chanina needs a little emuna or else a little humility. Okay, I'm curious what you mean by that if you're comfortable sharing.
Why doesn't he have faith that if that's where Rob is supposed to be, Hashem will get him there? Why does he think that it is his obligation or that he is so important that his body is needed in order for Hashem to do this?
Oh, very nice. Right. Like Rav is like, I'm going to be the reason why Rav gets run out of the country and goes to yeshivas. But yeah, there could be like much nicer, kinder ways to get Rav there. I don't know, a new job offer or I don't know, something better than that. Yeah, really good. Any other thoughts, reactions, questions people have to the story?
It feels like it's like the whole line about like, oh, Rob is different. Like we're supposed to be like, I don't know, maybe this is just my read. Like we're supposed to be really impressed that he's been like going every year for 13 years trying to appease him. But I don't know, it's just kind of sad. Like I don't know that that's something that we should valorize.
Right. Like, is this really an example of Lifnei Mishurat Hadin, like going above and beyond? I'm like, oh, I did even more than 3. It's actually like kind of awful.
Yeah.
And if we're saying like we did before, that I think Zoe mentioned, like if part of this is also that it seems that the person who like should be doing the appeasing doesn't want to do it, like why would 13 be the amount that gets you there? And actually might be more offensive to like continuously ask over and over again. Totally. Yeah, just tell him to go to Babylon. It's like, you know the ending, like just get him there. I'm curious as a question, like him getting to Babylon is like really important for us, like in the rabbinic tradition. Like we need to have these yeshivot exist. So I'm curious what you think about it in light of like the arc of Jewish history that the Stam who is like helping compile this Gemara knew already being like hundreds of years out of Israel at that point. Like this story that's so heartbreaking ultimately gets us the yeshivot of Surah and Pumbedita. Like, what does it mean that this is the background story to such an important, beautiful part of our heritage? Okay, Reverend Liz says, it feels like there's an underlying question, why are rabbis being awful to each other? And we need a reason to feel okay with it. Oh no. Gedolim culture. It's really hard for us to remember that rabbis are people who have interpersonal dynamic problems. And actually like they are just people just like us and like actually like, okay, maybe there was this dream and maybe also just like Rabbi was just really upset. Yeah, Jen, go for it.
Well, I was just wondering if we are supposed to assume that the character of the rabbis is impeccable and that everything must be done for a good reason. Yeah. Are we supposed to assume that they're infallible?
Yeah, I mean, they definitely, well, it depends, I guess, on this is Yeshivat Maharat, so I believe I can say that the rabbis are fallible, even though we deeply respect them. They are ultimately just people. And in some ways that can be like disappointing. Wouldn't you think like people who study Torah for a long time, like, I don't know, should have good midot, and sometimes that's not always true. Or that, I don't know, forgiveness and apologies and interpersonal relationships are really complicated. Like lahavdil, our relationship with God is like incredibly complex, but it's somewhat easier to follow. Then like sometimes people are just like not what you expect them to be. And sometimes apologies aren't enough, or because of what we were saying before, like people have expectations of each other to like get to certain conclusions. And if I were to say them out loud, then that kind of ruins the whole point. Like I'm going to guess, I'll go out on a limb here and say, I've experienced that before. I'm sure other people here have experienced that as well. And it's sometimes like not really explainable. Like even if you're a good communicator, even if you are a good person, sometimes like there's like an alchemy to like, I don't know, interpersonal relationships where like things sometimes work and things sometimes don't. And it's not always explained well. Well, Amina, go for it.
So I find myself thinking about the fact that so often the stories that the rabbis tell are stories that take place within a very self-contained world of the yeshiva, and the fact that within that world, like I could easily imagine if the Talmud were written today, there would be the story about the time that Rav Chia did not make a new pot of coffee after he got the last cup. Like there's these certain absolute expectations that have to be a certain way that are, sort of the unwritten rules of the place where they spend their entire life studying.
Yeah, right. Like also the specific location of like what they're doing and like what kind of kavod is like Rabbi Hanina not getting. Definitely there are analogs to like what that experience would look like today. It could be like standing up for a Rosh Hashiva. It could be, I don't know, even adding an emoji to a WhatsApp message. There's like lots of ways in which people can be frustrated with each other and read it as signs of disrespect, and then also sometimes like totally overread a situation. Okay, I'm looking at the chat. Wow. Emily says, note that the previous example before that we had of interpersonal strife was Yosef and the brothers, and that kickstarting our exile and like slavery in Egypt. And so to here, like another example of like interpersonal communication going wrong and then it leading to the entire Babylonian Talmud, but also a sense of randomness, like Miriam says. And Ramani Liz says, or also that Hashem can use even what might seem to be pettiness to create goodness in the world. Beautiful read. I want that one to be true. Interesting. Rabbis as archetypes. I'm not such a Jungian psychologist. I feel like that would be like a different way of thinking about these things, but I'd be curious to hear another time how that would work. Okay, these are all great ideas. Now I really want to hit it home. We like got some sprinkles of Levinas. Now I kind of want to take it away and like really see what Levinas does with these stories. Levinas is reading these stories to these Jewish and non-Jewish professors of philosophy at the Sorbonne in 1964. And he's beginning to use them as an opportunity for tochacha, for rebuke for them, about how they think that they can atone for the mistakes that they made as academics in the Holocaust, for allowing for Nazism to not just like rise on a political level, but also rise in the academy. And it's pretty nuts that he does this. I think it's epic. Okay, so what does he say? Now, in the story that is troubling us, what is at stake? Rav recognizes his fault and asks Hanina for forgiveness. The offended party can grant forgiveness when the offender has become conscious of the wrong he has done. First difficulty, the goodwill of the offended party. We are sure of it given the personality of Rav Hanina. Why then is he so unbending? Because there's another difficulty. Is the offender capable of measuring the extent of his wrongdoing? Do we know the limits of our ill will? And do we therefore truly have the capacity to ask for forgiveness? No doubt Rav thought that he had been a bit brusque in refusing to begin his reading of the text again when Rav Hanina Bar Chama, his master, came into the school. But Rav Hanina finds out through a dream more about Rav than Rav even knew about himself. The dream revealed Rav's secret ambitions, beyond the inoffensive gesture of the origin of the incident. Rav, without knowing it, wished to take his master's place. Given this, Rav Hanina could not forgive. How is one to forgive if the offender, unaware of his deeper thoughts, cannot ask for forgiveness? As soon as you have taken the path of offenses, you may have taken a path with no way out. There are two conditions for forgiveness: the goodwill of the offended party and the full awareness of the offender. But the offender is in essence unaware. The aggressiveness of the offender is perhaps very unconscious. Aggression is the lack of attention par excellence. In essence, forgiveness would be impossible. So now if you're imagining Levinas talking to this like group of philosophers, Jews, non-Jews, what he's kind of implicitly saying is, you're asking for us to forgive you. You're asking, saying, okay, we're going to provide reparations. The Holocaust was bad. We apologize. And now let's all integrate and be friends together in society. And what Levinas is saying is that you don't even understand what you're apologizing for. And you can say that. You can provide structure of reparation. Like that's like technically good. But do you even like comprehend what was going on and the deeper kind of darker ambitions that were behind that kind of hate. And he's using this story as a kind of, and if you were, I'm happy to send like the full text. It's about like 25 pages where he gets into like real specifics. But he's using this as an opportunity for this kind of, really tohaka, of really like reprimanding them for what they did. Okay, and now we're going to see like really hit hard. He's going to get totally explicit. He says, one can, if pressed to the limit, forgive the one who has spoken unconsciously. But it's very difficult to forgive Rav, who is fully aware and destined for a great fate, which was prophetically revealed to his master. One can forgive many Germans, but there are some Germans it is difficult to forgive. It is difficult to forgive Heidegger. If Hanan could not forgive the just and humane Rav because he was also the brilliant Rav, it is even less possible to forgive Heidegger. There and brought back to the present, the new attempts to clear Heidegger to take away his responsibility, unceasing attempts which, it must be admitted, are at the origin of this colloquium. So this is like when he really drops the bomb. Heidegger, Martin Heidegger, is a philosopher from the 1920s. He also officially registered with the Nazi Party, and he actually ratted out a lot of Jewish professors, including his own PhD advisor, Edmund Husserl, who also Levinas worked with at the time. And this was about making, like, at the time, there was a question of Heidegger should just like go back into the academy for it to be totally normal for him to be there, even though he was actively a part of the Nazi Party himself. And he's saying that there's no way you could ever forgive someone like that. He's saying, even though he is a brilliant man, he's like an incredibly important philosopher within the world of continental philosophy, which is a more existential modern kind of philosophy. There's no way we can really forgive him because he's not really mad. A lot of his philosophy also did have like deeply anti-Semitic roots, and he's not willing to take that away. And then he uses that then to like, that's like kind of when everyone like, there was a shock through the audience of like, oh my gosh, he said it. Because all of them knew Heidegger and like knew that this was happening. And he's using then this Talmudic story to get there. We could say that's a little bit creative, like where he's going. I think that we saw in the learning of it together, there's a lot of ways to read these texts, right? You could say, is the issue of 3 times of forgiveness an issue for the person forgiving, or is it for the person asking for forgiveness? What feels more important? Bein adam l'makom, bein adam l'chavero. But ultimately, what Levinas is doing is using this story to show the power of bein adam l'chavero, of interpersonal woes, and to say that in order to really mend those things, you don't have just a Yom Kippur to clean you, or a reparations to just like make you now innocent and ready to go. You need to actually be able to do the work of repentance and repair. And that requires a sense of self-awareness. It requires knowing the like inner, deeper ambitions you have, like Rav not realizing that like, he himself wanted to rise to the top. And that's really difficult. And so like when Levinas did this was the first Talmudic story he did. It was received very well, and he got asked to do it 8 more times. So it actually had impact. I think, here now I'll stop sharing. Oh, wow. Okay, great timing. What I think is really powerful about this kind of way of thinking about Talmud is we could have just read the story, right? Like the stories were really cool and dramatic and fun. And I think that we also were able to tease out a lot of ways of thinking about forgiveness and about tshuva and like what does authentic tshuva look like. But to me, what's really powerful about doing it with Levinas is all the way back to the quote at the beginning about the eggs and about the ox, which is that he's reminding us that the way that we should be reading Talmud is that it's always about these deeper philosophical questions that directly impact our lives. And he is really taking that idea so seriously that he brought it to the academy and used it to like actually execute justice for something that he really cared about, for his teachers, his professors, for the entire philosophical project that like he himself was worried about. Like so many of the people that he respected then like really contributed to the world of Nazism, and he wants to redeem philosophy and show that there's a way to make sure that we can all care for each other. And in particular, a Jewish voice in philosophy. Like he thinks this way of doing Talmud is a kind of philosophy as well. It's like Jewish philosophy needs to come from the sources, the authentic sources. So we shouldn't be like responding to a Christian text. We should be reading Talmud and saying like, how's it going to affect my life? Which again is why someone really needs to take on that project for real. Like he's like opened this up as an opportunity for the next generation of Talmudists. So if you ever want to have like a future PhD topic, that would probably be a fun one. But I thought that this framing, at least for me, when thinking about the high holidays, is we can read a story on Agadah and like read even a halacha like the 3 times and say like, okay, I think I kind of understand how tshuva works. But I felt like at least reading Levinas in as a kind of commentator and then knowing what he did with this work and like actually implemented it in the world for good hopefully that could be a kind of chizuk for us in this high holiday season, to be thinking about how can these kinds of stories from the Gemara or even halacha move us in ways that genuinely lead us to action, and to action that can help us with our own interpersonal relationships, because we saw that's the only way we can mend them. We won't have just Yom Kippur to be mechaper. We're going to need to be able to work on those things with each other. So with all of that, that's all I have to say. If anyone has any questions or thoughts, I'm happy to hear. But otherwise, thank you so much for learning with me and for coming along on the Levinas journey. I know he's a bit difficult, but I do think him as a person, and hopefully you seeing the like execution of his ideas in real time, shows you that there's what there to work with.
It reads so deeply right now in this time for me, especially. I have such a, so I was teaching today, and one of my students thank God, made a joke about beepers. And I told them about this multiple levels of, on one hand, feeling proud for our, Israeli abilities, as incredible abilities of the secret services to accomplish it, and at the same time, human suffering. And it's so hard and so tiring to also think about like cancel culture and unwanted consequences of Levinas, in a way.
Well, yeah, I was initially like thinking I was like, oh, that'd be a great like hot button topic to like advertise Levinas, like, oh, cancel culture. But what I really do think, like, without getting into those politics, what I appreciate about what he's doing is I think he's articulating like what constitutes hearing from someone or not. Like, I think he is providing a helpful framework of like, people should apologize for things if they like truly understand what they're apologizing for, which I feel like often like that kind of nuance doesn't happen like in the political sphere of talking about these things. And I feel like that even like we can talk about on that kind of political level, and also I just think like interpersonally, like again, from what I said before, I've definitely had times where I've wanted apologies or I've given apologies and it's like not been super clear or like authentic, and I just think like it has a lot to like help us articulate certain situations that we all have been in our own lives too, without even getting to like the larger ideological questions of it. That I appreciate, that it doesn't have to be like, oh, tshuva, you should do it, you should apologize, but he's helping articulate like what exactly gets you to do that kind of tshuva, like what is the process that should look like. So thank you.
No, I agree with Levinas in his times. What he did, it was brilliant and courageous and important and essential because the world was in a full. I mean, today we have a different level of Holocaust denial, but it took 20 years for world to realize what even happened. And
sorry, go for it.
Yeah.
I was gonna say 1964 is also like a really bold choice. Like that was the year that there were the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. Like this was the first time in the public sphere that they were actually hearing testimonies about Auschwitz. And there were people who were genuinely shocked about what was happening. And so for him to do it then, it doesn't seem to me like a coincidence. Like he was also responding to what was in the air at that time in a way that I think is really fun. It's almost like reading a sermon and then like thinking like what was happening that Shabbat that got the rabbi to talk about that thing. So yeah.
Brilliant. No, this is very important. I'm so European. I take those things for granted, and then I felt like, okay, let me put back. I'm absolutely appreciating what he did, and I have full. Then in my context today, I have all those additional layers, which.
Really. What was bothering Levinas? Great Nechama Leibovitz. Good. Okay, I think that's all I have to say. You're welcome to, if you have any follow-ups, if you want to actually see the full PDF of this story, and I also have all other ones, all 9 of them. I'm putting my email address here, and I think it's also on the source sheet. And also myself personally, like I'm trying to think about what would be meaningful ways to like think about teaching more Levinas. So if you have more thoughts about it, let me know. Feel free to send me an email. Okay.
Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, Rachel, what do I do now? Do I just leave the Zoom?
I will end it. Good night, everyone. Thank you so much, Sophia. Thank you.
Awesome.
That was fantastic. Phenomenal.
Nice seeing everyone.
Clear.